Can you say, do you know how your parents met?
I don't know how they met. Many years, gosh, I have been married many years, until a woman called me on the phone once, for some reason out of the clear blue sky, and she looked me up. She had seen my wedding announcement in a paper or something. Dad's mother put an announcement in the paper. She knew Pearl Schechter, daughter of Louis Schechter. She clipped it out, and for some reason she found me years later, and she called me up, and she introduced herself to me. She knew my mother before she was married, and she met my father, and she said before they were married, she invited them over, and they had dinner at her house, and she invited them. She knew my mother because my mother, I don't know, my mother wasn't married, but either my mother trimmed hats. She was like a milliner, and she was paid piecework.
This was in Allentown?
This was in Philadelphia.
Okay.
My father, for some reason, ended up in Philadelphia too, and he met my mother. And she said that my mother got her the job, or she met her on the job. I think they worked together, decorating. My mother was able to make, she said, lots of money, because my mother was real good and she could decorate these hats, and it was piecework. But she said she could never do it as well. She never learned how to do it like my mother did. But she did have her over for dinner with my father, either right after they were married or when they got married. Where or what, I don't know how they got married.
Do you know anything about your mother's family, when they came over, or what her parents were like?
I don't know when they
Their
came
names,
over.
anything?
I do know my mother's family, my aunt. What I know about my mother's family, I found out from my mother's sister, my Aunt Molly. I don't know if you remember her. You may have. No, you don't. You know another Molly.
Oh, okay.
That was not my Aunt Molly, because I remember I was pregnant with you when my Aunt Molly died, and for some Jewish superstition, I didn't go to the wedding because I was pregnant. Funeral. Sorry, my aunt's funeral. I did, so you never knew. I have pictures of her somewhere in the book. Anything I know about my mother's family, I know through my aunt, who raised me when my mother became ill when I was a little girl. My father took me to Philadelphia, and I was, for 1 or 2 years, while my mother was in the hospital, I lived with my Aunt Molly. And so she was sort of like my mother until my father remarried again. But what I do know, I know from her, and I know that my mother's parents had a stable in Romania. I guess like it would be like a taxi service now, but he had a carriage or something.
Was this in Bucharest?
Bucharest, yes. And I always thought they might be poor, but my aunt said, no, they weren't poor. They had lots of geese. So I guess if you had enough to eat, you weren't poor. That's all I know. But nobody was really rich. So that's all I know of my mother's family. There were some, my mother had brothers and sisters. I knew my Uncle Dave. As I said, my Aunt Molly used to visit him in Philadelphia, and he lived in Winfield and was a shoemaker, and he's the one that had the parrot in the shop. And then he died. And I think there was another brother I never knew, and when I first came to Philadelphia, my cousins, Dan and Sophie, we went to New York, and I met some cousins there. These were men and their family. There were 1, 2, 3 brothers from another uncle. I never knew the uncle, and I think these brothers are probably dead, but their name was Moskowitz. my mother's maiden name.
Okay. Can you say a little bit about Aunt Molly, the sort of person she was? You kept in touch with her for
Yeah.
over the years.
Yeah. Aunt Molly was married. Well, she came from Romania also. What can I say? What can I tell you? Her husband was a tailor. She married a Harry Glasser, Glasser. And they had 2 sons, which were my cousins, Paul and Dan Glasser. Now, you met Dan, Paul Glasser, in Philadelphia that summer that you were there.
Mm-hmm.
He came with his daughter and her boyfriend, her husband, and you went around the streets with him or something. You did.
Okay.
You did. But Paul was my Aunt Molly's son, and then there was Dan and Sophie. Dan married Sophie, and Dad passed away about 7, 8 years ago. Sophie, as far as I know, is still living in Philadelphia, and they had children, and their children had, children. But that's all I can tell you. There were some, my Uncle Harry had a sister named Eva. She came to the house a few times. You may remember a little woman, Eva Glasser.
I think so.
Well, that was my Uncle Harry, my Aunt Molly's husband's sister. And I remember as a little girl, though, visiting Philadelphia, and I met Uncle Harry's mother, and she was really like the old Orthodox women. That's the only person I ever saw that had the sheitel, the wig on her head. But they were awful things. They weren't like wigs now. If you go to a Lubavitcher wedding, these women, they have beautiful wigs. They cover their hair. They're not supposed to show it, but they have gorgeous wigs that are so beautiful you can't even tell they're wigs. But this woman had like some rat's nest on her head. That's all I remember about, the Philadelphia.
So basically,